John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Before we get into the episode, just want to let you know that this is the free version of the podcast, and all that means is that we are way behind where I'm at in Patreon. So if you are loving this podcast and you need more John Constantine in your life, definitely go check us out at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire Hellblazer library that I've recorded so far. And also you get access to the exclusive episodes of the Planes, Trains, and Comic Books main podcast. So if any of that sounds good to you, definitely go over to patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, and sign up there. And with that out of the way, let's get into the issue. Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today we are reading issue number 110. And just a little catch up from the last issue. John traveled to the English countryside to help out one of Chaz's relatives, who had a problem with something killing sheep. And it turned out that it was werewolves, so we got a cool werewolf issue where John had to figure that out, and it did not end the way you think it would, with John, like, killing the werewolves or stopping them somehow. He didn't do any of that stuff. He just let them go after they gave him a warning saying that this is not their time, they shouldn't be here, and that something evil was coming, and of course John is in the middle of that. So that was the main plot that happened, but in the background we did see John meet a new person. He met a young African-American woman named Danny, and she is a reporter for a tabloid-like newspaper called the Daily World Star. And she had heard about John and was trying to interview him because of that orgy from a couple issues back, where John was hired to do magic for a bunch of rich people at this orgy party. And Danny wanted to talk to John because she wanted to know which rich people were there. Were there any royal people or celebrities that she could write about in her tabloid? And that's pretty much where we left off. So first things first, with issue 110, we got the cover. We see the Tower of London, and flying away from it, we see a bunch of ravens. And in the midst of those ravens, in the background, we see John Constantine's face. And of course, he is smoking, and he's looking out from them ominously. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Paul Jenkins with art by Sean Phillips. And as we turn to the first page, we see a man building something with a hammer and wooden pegs. And on the ground, there is a dead man who looks like he's had his eyes ruptured or exploded. And as the hammer comes down over and over, we see a raven fly over him. And then we see a little boy approach the man building the box, and he says, "Oi, mister!" But the man doesn't take notice, he just continues hammering, and the boy asks, "What you making?" And the man that he's asking this is wearing a shroud, so you can't see his face. But he does answer the boy, and he says, "A box, little John." And then he stops his hammering, and he motions over to a bunch of plant beings that I think are supposed to be beings like Jack of the Green, who are representations of the plant life in different areas of Britain. And as he points to them, he says to the boy, "Look at them, cancered and diseased, and without hope of recovery. All of my kind are dying or dead now, and the fault lies entirely with me." And then he points down to the box that he's making, and he says, "The box must be deep, child, deep enough to hold them all. This leprosy, it rots their souls until just a memory of them remains." And then the boy walks over to the box that we can now see looks kind of like a coffin. As the boy looks inside of it, he says, "Leprosy? Thera disease, is it?" And then the man walks over next to the boy, and he tussles his hair, and he says, "Aye, lad, that it is, and we have all become infected." Then the man takes a step back, and he says to the boy, "This is not a place for you, little man. You must go." And the boy looks up at him and asks, "Can't I stay with you then? I could help you, couldn't I?" Then the man gets very angry, and we actually see his face, even though it's kind of still obscured by shadow. We can definitely make out that this is Jack of the Green. And to the boy's question if he can stay, Jack screams back, "No!" And the child, of course, is terrified, so he begins screaming as he falls to the ground in fear. Then we see John Constantine wake up, and he is screaming just like the little boy was. And if you notice, Jack of the Green called him Little John earlier. So I believe this was all a dream John was having, and he was the little boy in it. So as John wakes from that nightmare, he sits up and he says, "Fuck." Then he reaches for his pack of cigarettes, and next to him we see a woman in bed, and she is trying to sleep, and thinking John said fuck because he's trying to have sex with her, She says tiredly, "Don't push your luck, pal. I'm still tired from last time." And also on this page, we see the name of this issue is Last Man Standing, Part 1, A Different Kind of Tension. And as John lights his cigarette, we see the woman sit up because she's woken up now, and we see it is Danny, the reporter from the last issue, and she looks at John sleepily and asks, "What's the matter? You okay, hon?" And John answers, "Can't sleep." And then he lays back down in the bed and is kind of sitting up on the pillows. So Danny moves closer to him and says, "You never sleep." And as John takes a drag of his cigarette, he jokingly says, "My turn to watch for the Martians, isn't it?" And then Danny cuddles against John's chest, and John puts his arm over her, and Danny closes her eyes to fall asleep again, and as she drifts off, she says, "Silly boy, there's no one here but us humans." Then she falls asleep, and then John looks down at her, kind of like he's pondering how he got here. Then he leans back, and he takes another drag of his cigarette, and his narration says, "And with that profound comment, she's off to the land of Nod once more, leaving me alone with the ticking of a clock and the tense night air. Last time she did this was over a plate of spaghetti at Dino's. Just my luck to fall for a narcoleptic, eh? Funny how that works, though. About love and narcolepsy, I mean. How they hit so unexpectedly. You don't even know what's happened." Then we get a little flashback of John and Danny's relationship over the last month or so. So we see John and her having sex, then we see them on a date at a cafe, and over these panels, John's narration says, "I first met Danny after that little perverts convention at Oxford. She had the dirt on my participation, so I felt duty-bound to fly the flag for my country, so to speak. Screwing a United States citizen is hardly politically correct in these enlightened times, but in the spirit of international cooperation and all that. Of course, she was only squeezing me for information about Harcourt Fenton. I could respect that approach, though. So much to my own surprise, the first time I saw her wasn't the only time. Danny's a right laugh as it happens. She writes daft articles for some highbrow American rag called the Weekly World Star. As far as I can ascertain, this involves getting tanked up to the gills and speculating to the whereabouts of Elvis Presley or any of Adolf Hitler's 30 clones. So I went out with her a few more times. Let her get into the old Constantine inner circle, you might say. The poor cow had no idea of the possible ramifications, mind. But I was happy enough. Even found myself relaxing for a change. Next thing I know, Danny had the official seal of approval from my mates. And now I'm not just John anymore. I'm John and Danny." Then we come from the flashbacks back to the room where John is smiling as he smokes, and his narration continues. "Kit seems like a world away. I suppose a part of me still loves her. But that part now resides in hell. I have this vague, uncertain memory of what it all felt like, but now I'm learning it all over again." And then John puts out his cigarette, and he looks over at Danny, who's now turned off of him, and she's sleeping on her side of the bed, and his narration continues. "Still, just as any relationship begins to take off, it can always come crashing down in flames. I know that now more than at any time in my life. As usual, I'm finding it hard to just enjoy the moment. Maybe it's a fear of the future that has me so worked up." Then John begins to massage the front of his head with his hands, and he's baring his teeth in pain, and his narration says, "God knows something must be responsible for this hammering in my head." Then we turn the page and we cut to daytime, and we're somewhere on the streets in London, and we see an old man in a suit walking with what look like private security guards, and these guards are on super alert to the extent that they're acting like the president's Secret Service or something. So as this old man walks down the street with his security guards, we see a nerdy man walk up, and he's got a big smile on his face, and the security guards immediately put their hand up and block him, but he calls out to the old man, "Hello, my name's Dennis. I can hear the banging, you know. It's very loud. It's making my head ache something awful." And the guard says to the man, "That's close enough, sunshine." And then Dennis motions behind him, and we see there's a crowd that is gathered, almost like they've been waiting for this old man. And Dennis says, Actually, it's not just me. We can all hear it. I got here last week. I was the first. Everyone else showed up afterwards. Can you tell us what's going on?" And as the old man looks at the crowd, he says, "No, I cannot. But I can alleviate your symptoms if that is what you wish." And I should describe this old man. He's a white guy, and he's wearing dark sunglasses with round lenses. And he kind of looks like Colonel Sanders. He's got a big mustache and a goatee. So in answer to the old man saying he has something that will cure Dennis, Dennis holds out his hand, and the old man pulls some sort of disc that's about the size of a silver dollar out of his pocket, and he hands this white disc to Dennis. And as he does, he says, "For the toxification and calcience of the nervous system, Swallow this, and the noise will cease altogether. Then he turns and he walks into a building, leaving Dennis standing there holding the white disc in his hands, and Dennis yells after him, Right to! Thanks very much! Then we cut to the inside of the building, and we're in some sort of laboratory, and we see inside of a bell jar there is a floating snare drum. And we can see from all the machines that it's hooked up to and hear that it is beating loudly and with a steady pulse. And there's a man bent over staring at the snare drum in the bell jar, and as the old man walks in, he says, What have you found? And the man in the room replies, Mr. Myrddin. Not much, unfortunately, sir. All we know is that the drum is somehow beating of its own accord, and the beats are increasing in both rapidity and intensity. Rather eerie, actually. And Myrddin asks, The cause? And the man answers, The actual cause is beyond our capacity to measure. It's pure speculation at the moment. As to the effect, well, perhaps you've encountered some of the sympathetics outside? And then he motions with his thumb to the front door. And of course, he's talking about Dennis and all those people that are outside that are hearing this rhythmic pounding in their head. And Myrddin isn't very happy at this explanation that there is no explanation, and he says to the man, I'm well aware of the assembled listeners at the front gate, but they are a minor distraction at present. Suffice it to say, I have made the first few steps in bringing that situation under control. And as he says this last line, we get a panel that is outside, and we see Dennis on the ground looking like he's choking, probably after he swallowed whatever that white disc was that Myrddin gave him. Then we come back to the scientist guy in the lab, and he's trying to explain why he doesn't have any answers, and he says, Well, here's the problem, sir. We're very much in the dark with this thing. MOD won't even say why we're interested. And I don't know if you're aware of the drum's rather curious history. Then we get a couple panels that are flashing back to the past, where this drum was apparently used during historically significant events. In the first panel, we see men that look like they're from the 1600s. They're wearing conquistador armor or something. And they are covering their ears like they're in pain, and we see the drum is kind of floating in the background. And the scientist narrates over this. Turns out, the thing used to belong to Sir Francis Drake of all people. It's been in the British Museum for ages. According to legend, Drake's drum is supposed to beat whenever Britain is in peril. They say it first went off during the Civil War after the Battle of Edgehill. Then we get a panel of some Nazis, and over that the scientist's narration continues. The one thing we do know, and there are reliable witnesses who will attest to this fact, is that the drum actually did beat on the day of Operation Sea Lion. That was intended to be the day of the invasion of Britain. The Germans canceled it because of bad weather, although no one knew it at the time. Then, almost like if Myrddin doesn't care about this history lesson, he doesn't say anything to the guy in the lab. He just walks over to an office door, and as he puts his hand on the handle, the scientist says, Well, anyway, it might be a reaction to certain electromagnetic resonances. That's my best guess. Or a vibration caused by an American stealth technology, perhaps. I'm afraid the Air Force has been less than forthcoming. Then as Myrddin opens the door and still doesn't say anything to the scientist, one of his security guards turns to the other and jokes, On the other hand, it could be a fucking magic trick. And at that, Myrddin whirls around and says, Magic? Your considered professional opinion, Reynolds. And Reynolds looks very scared as he replies, Sorry, sir, I was just... But he's cut off by Myrddin, who turns back to enter the office and says, Well, don't just anything. Keep your tongue, and you might just keep your job. Is that understood? Then he walks in the room and slams the door, and Reynolds answers, Perfectly, sir. But then he turns and he says under his breath, You miserable Welsh git. Then we turn the page and we cut to a pub with John and Danny, and they're hanging out with Michelle, Rich, and Cider. And John is picking up Cider, and Cider's yelling, Bollocks, bollocks, bollocks. And John jokes, Blimey, it's Frank Bruno. Then he puts Cider down, and we see Danny ask Michelle, So what's the big surprise then, you guys? You finally getting married? And Michelle answers, Now, remember when I puked up me curry the other night? Well, I should have bleeding guessed, shouldn't I? And then unable to keep in his excitement, Rich jumps up and says to John, Never a dull moment, eh? Slarky's got a fucking butt in the oven. And Danny smiles and says to Michelle, You're pregnant? And Michelle smiles and nods. And then John jokingly asks Rich as he sits down, How'd that happen then, Rich? And Rich answers, Fuck knows, mate. If it comes out with a turban on its head, it was probably the postman. Then Michelle turns to John and says, Well, anyway, John, we was wondering, You're a good mate and all that. Anyway, we'd want you to be the godfather. And John is taken aback by this request. He did not expect to be, I guess, invited into the family like this. And he turns to Rich and says, what? I can't. I mean... And then he turns and he looks down at Cider, who's playing with a Batmobile on the ground. And then John's narration says, my old fears suddenly resurface, unbidden and most definitely unwanted. They're carried on a tidal wave of guilt and doubt. I'm the man whose stupidity and arrogance almost consign the soul of their innocent son to hell. I'm the one whose proximity always puts the people I care about in danger. People die because of me. Or worse. And Rich seems to know the thoughts that are running through John's head, so he stands up and he puts his hand on John's shoulder and he says, listen, Conjob, about what happened before with Cider. It weren't your fault, mate. Besides, you sorted it out, didn't you? Come on, what's the verdict? And before John can answer, Dani stands up and gives John a big hug, and she turns to Rich and says, he'd be delighted. And of course, John looks shocked as she says this, but he does not give an answer himself, and he doesn't say anything more. Then we turn the page, and we cut to the Tower of London, and we see 5 different-looking gentlemen standing in one of the ramparts of it, and these 5 men are very distinct-looking. One of them looks very young and kind of dapper, and he's got a suit on, but he also has blue hair that is parted down the middle, and that classic 90s boy haircut. Then we see a hunched-over older gentleman with long white hair. He's balding, and he also looks blind. There's a big stocky guy that has a t-shirt and jeans on. Another one of the men has a severely deformed face. Kind of looks like he might have elephantitis or something. And then the last man is the strangest. He kind of looks like he is disappearing. Like you could tell he is in the shape of a man, but almost like he's 2D, like he's flat. And then he is very, very blurry. So we see the stocky man in the t-shirt and jeans find a dead raven on this parapet. And as he bends down to pick it up, he says, the ravens are leaving the tower. They can smell the disease in the air. And the old man looks up and he says, hi, and they're not alone, Owen. Every living thing hears this dire beating. It rumbles across the hills, but emanates from no source. In all my 15 centuries here, I've never been so afraid. There's a shift in the land's tension. All of the portents point towards the same thing. Britain is going to die. And then the good-looking man with the blue hair turns to the old guy and says, it wasn't supposed to be this way. We were supposed to return in triumph following Arthur's lead, but he's nowhere to be found. I don't like this world. It smells of burning and corruption. They're dismantling the infrastructure, removing all of the stones, destroying our old lanes. They're cutting and digging until Albion becomes unrecognizable. Furthermore, we have discovered who has instigated this violation, and it's the worst news of all. Myrddin has woken on Bardsey and has killed Gwyld. No warning, no explanation as to why he'd suddenly resurface after all these centuries. He tempts Albion's new leaders, urging them to defile the land for the promise of gold. We are left to face him alone, brothers, and face him we must. And right there, I'm going to explain a little bit because I had to look this up. I am not very steeped in Arthurian legend, but that is what this is. These are, I guess, what's left of the Knights of the Round Table, and Myrddin is another name for Merlin. So it seems for some reason, Merlin has woken, and he has begun to execute some kind of plan that involves destroying all of the ley line stones and powerful places of magic. And a lot of this destruction was seen earlier in this run before we knew its significance. For instance, we did see an issue where Rich took John to a protest where the government was tearing down some of these magic sites to put in a freeway. So apparently that's what's happening all around, and destroying those magical sites, which is eventually going to destroy Albion, which is another name for Britain. So after the young man finishes explaining, the man with the facial deformity says, why? Why do you seem so intent on leading us to our destruction, Sanda? Myrddin can only be enchained by a king of rightful blood. Arthur's afraid. He must be. Or else, why would he have deserted us? And the blue-haired man answers, I don't know, brother. I just know we must make an attempt to stop the contamination. But if we can't have our king to lead us, we'll have to look elsewhere. Then we turn the page and we cut to one of these construction sites that is destroying these magical areas. And we see there's a bunch of construction guys waiting to start with their equipment. and there's a politician who's trying to talk to a bunch of protesters. So he is on a podium, and he's trying to calm the protesters down, saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, please, can we exhibit a modicum of restraint? We're cutting travel time off the A12 into Colchester by an average of 6 minutes. I don't see you complaining about that." Then one of the protesters yells, "You people have no bloody right!" And the politician gets a sour look on his face, and he looks at the man and says, "I beg to differ. This is what most people want." Then another protester, who's an old woman holding a sign that says "Grave Robber," screams out, "It's the burial mound of an ancient Celtic king, and you're ripping it up. How in God's name do you justify that?" And the politician looks sternly at her and answers, "Because that's what everyone voted for." Then we turn the page and we cut to a little bit later at the same site, where it seems they've been digging for a little while, and they seem to have found something, because we see one of the construction guys pointing to a bunch of boxes on the ground that look like they've been buried and old, and he is showing them to Myrddin. Because like those Knights of the Round Table said, Myrddin is behind all of this destruction of these magical places. So as the construction worker points to the boxes, he says to Myrddin, "Here's what we pulled out of the chamber. Look, I'm not one to argue, especially with the schedule and all that, but aren't there regulations for old artifacts?" And Myrddin answers, "Not at all. You've done a very fine job." And the construction guy says, "If you say so, Mr. Myrddin, all we found was some pots and jewelry and some manky old box." And at the mention of this box, Myrddin perks up and he says, "A box? Give it to me, now!" And the construction guy gives him the box, and as Myrddin looks at it, he says, "Ah, yes, it feels right. Just the perfect weight and texture, you see." And this box is about the size of a hat box, which makes me think there's supposed to be a head inside or something. And as Myrddin opens it, he says, "I wonder if it might be." But he finds the box is empty as he removes the lid, and he says, "Oh, what a shame." Then he says to his security guards as he points to the construction workers, "Take these men to the perimeter, please. I wish to be alone for a moment." So as the security guards escort the construction workers out, the construction worker turns to one of the guards and asks, "Who's this arsehole then?" And the guard replies, "Same as usual. Someone you avoid making eye contact with like he's the fucking plague." So they walk away from the dig site, and we see Myrddin raise his hands to the sky, and he says, "I should have known. You would not have left the vessel where it could so easily be found. I warn you, the more tiresome this becomes, the worse it will be for you and your cherished Albion. Why won't you face me?" And he removes his dark sunglasses, and he looks up at the sky, and his pupils are completely faded, so I believe he's supposed to be blind. But he doesn't walk with a cane or anything, so obviously there's some supernatural stuff there. Then he looks at the countryside around him, and he continues saying, "I don't think I can feel your fear. You're hiding, aren't you? I always knew there was a touch of cowardice in you. I will disinter every tomb and pollute every field. I swear it. You will watch your country wither and die unless you return what is rightfully mine." And then he picks up the box he found, and he smashes it on the ground as he yells, "I'll taint it with toxins and rust. Your people will beg for death 1,000 times before they succumb to the poison. Do you hear me?" Then we turn the page, and we cut to John, and he is in some sort of cave, and he's holding a torch along with another person who is shrouded so we can't see their face. But it kind of looks like Jack of the Green from the beginning, because he's wearing something similar, but we can't see his face or his hands, so it's hard to tell. But that person says to John, "You can't have it, John. It's not yours." And he's pointing to a box on the ground that looks exactly the same as the one that Myrddin found. And we can see behind the box, as John raises his torch to get a better look at it, there is a very, very large coiled serpent. And the man says to John, "If you reach for it, the dragon will devour you. He wants it too, but if he comes into the light, he will die. This can only be resolved by a king of rightful blood." And John asks, "Why?" And the hooded man replies, "Because that is God's will." John doesn't seem to like that explanation, so he drops his torch at the hooded man's feet, and he walks towards the serpent and the box and says, "I don't fucking care about God's will." Then we turn the page, and we cut to John waking up in bed. And you've probably guessed, but that was a nightmare he was having with the cave and the serpent. And as John sits up from his dream, we see the young man with blue hair is in his room, staring out of the window. and he says, "Wake up, John Constantine." And John is confused and he says, "Huh?" And the blue-haired man continues, "You encountered the dragon, didn't you? Its stench pervades the air even from within your dream." And John, who's not having any of this, says, "Anytime you're ready then, mate. Who the fuck are you?" And that gets the blue-haired man's attention, so he finally turns around from the window and looks at John and says, "Huh, do you think you'd believe me if I told you, John?" And as John grabs a cigarette from the nightstand, he lights it and says, "Try me." And the blue-haired man replies, "All right then. I'm Sanda, so fair of face that no man will dare face me in battle. I am eternal, and by the grace of God have walked this land for 15 centuries. I am the son of Arakel, and I am a cousin of Arthur, your rightful king." And John bursts into laughter, so it seems that Sanda was right in thinking that John wouldn't believe him, and John says, "Ha ha, nice one. Where's your mates then? Outside revving up the wooden rabbit?" And this, of course, is a reference to Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And Sanda turns and says, "Very droll. I've seen that film. It's quite funny, actually." But then he gets very serious and his eyes light up, and he says, "But look below the surface of any legend, and you'll find a truth. You already know that much, Constantine. What you consider to be a myth is real to us, John. We've lived your old stories, helped them develop, and now it's all coming full circle. Drake's drum beats across the land, and the ravens are leaving the Tower of London, all portending the end of Albion. The dragon, Myrddin, has returned. He is polluting every field, destroying every spiritual site, all with the willing aid of your elected officials." Then Sanda sits on the bed and he puts his head in his hands and he says, "We're supposed to be prepared for this, but it's not easy being alive for so long. You become complacent, you see. You forget why you're here in the first place." And then he looks up at John and continues saying, "This is not our time, Constantine. We need someone to lead us, to give our fight direction. You've got all the right connections. Will you help us?" But John doesn't answer. He just stares very calmly at Sanda, and he takes another drag of his cigarette, and his narration says, "I weigh all the possibilities, consider all the ramifications of my decision. See, I'm older and wiser now. I have responsibilities, to my mates, to my new godchild, to Danny. Used to be, I only had myself to worry about, but the rules have changed. There's really only one response I can give, isn't there?" Then we see John walk over to the open door and motion outward with his thumb as he looks at Sanda, and he says, "Don't let the door hit you on the way out." And Sanda looks very shocked and in despair at this response. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.